The lights of the debate stage burned hot, cameras trained on every gesture, every breath. A senator leaned forward, voice dripping with accusation. "Tell the American people right now, are you guilty, yes or no?" The question cut through the auditorium like a blade, a challenge meant to corner, to humiliate. For a moment, the crowd leaned in, waiting for the obvious, an anxious defense, a long-winded explanation, a desperate plea for credibility. But instead, the accused did something no one expected. They didn't stumble. They didn't panic. They didn't even flinch. They paused, their silence louder than thunder. Then, with the faintest smile, they tilted the question back. "Tell me," they asked calmly, "why are you so afraid of what I represent?" The crowd erupted, not in laughter, not in pity, but in applause. Roars shook the hall, as if the tables had flipped in a single heartbeat. The accuser blinked, suddenly smaller under the glare of the lights. It was a reversal so swift, so clean, that the audience felt as though they had witnessed a magic trick. No defense, no excuses, no scrambling for dignity, just composure, an unshakable refusal to play by someone else's rules. And in that refusal lay the secret to power. You see, defending yourself is the trap. The moment you start explaining, you've already lost. You've accepted their frame, stepped into their cage, and confessed without confessing. Machiavelli, the Renaissance master of power, knew this 5 centuries ago. He watched rulers rise and fall, not because they lacked armies or wealth, but because they lacked the courage to stay silent when provoked. In that silence, strength is born. In that refusal, authority hardens. And in that tiny smile, the world sees not weakness, but dominance. This is not just politics. It's psychology. It's survival. And it is far more dangerous than most people ever realize. Because defending yourself doesn't just weaken your argument, it weakens you. But why? Why does defending yourself instantly unravel your power, strip you of authority, and hand victory to your enemies before the fight has even begun? The answer, as Machiavelli discovered, is darker and far more devastating than you think. The lesson of refusing to defend yourself is not some dusty relic of the Renaissance. It is alive, ruthless, and everywhere around us. Every time a politician is accused on national television, every time a CEO faces a scandal, every time a neighbor is confronted in public, the same invisible trap is set. Defend yourself and you look guilty. Stay calm, refuse the frame, and you flip the entire power dynamic in your favor. History is littered with examples of leaders who walked straight into this trap. Kings who rushed to deny rumors of betrayal, only to appear weaker. Emperors who delivered speeches protesting their innocence, but whose very protests sealed their fate. Even presidents who, under the glare of cameras, insisted, "I am not guilty," only to be remembered for that desperate denial, not their innocence. The pattern repeats itself century after century. Defending is surrender, and it isn't confined to thrones or palaces. In the modern world, the battlefield is digital. One tweet, one viral clip, one headline can trigger a storm. The internet doesn't wait for explanations. It feasts on the first sign of weakness. The moment you start defending yourself in front of millions of watching eyes, you are not controlling the narrative. You are chasing it breathless while your accuser leads the charge. Think about it. A smear campaign hits the front page. A courtroom battle begins to unfold. A shaky video spreads across social media. What do people expect? They expect a denial, a justification, a nervous attempt to salvage reputation. And when that happens, the public leans back and says, they wouldn't be defending so hard if they weren't guilty of something. The trap closes, and the damage is permanent. But now imagine the opposite. Imagine a leader, an immigrant worker, a young activist, anyone standing in the public square accused of corruption, dishonor, or deceit. Instead of defending, they turn the accusation into a mirror. They ask the accuser why they are so desperate. They stand with calm silence. Or they pivot to a higher principle. This is not about me. This is about what you're afraid of. The crowd feels it instantly. Authority shifts. The accuser shrinks. And the accused is no longer a victim, they are the one holding the torch. This is the brutal simplicity of the power game. Defending yourself means you've agreed to play by their rules. Refusing to defend yourself means you've rewritten the rules entirely. The difference between humiliation and dominance, between collapse and victory, can come down to one moment, one choice. And here's the FOMO truth. The next time someone accuses you, whether in public, at work, or even in your personal life, your entire reputation could hang on that single decision. Do you defend, explaining, justifying, apologizing? Or do you flip the power instantly like Machiavelli taught? Because make no mistake, this is not just theory, it is not just history. It is the very strategy that determines who rises, who falls, and who is remembered. But where did this philosophy come from? How did one man see through the illusion of defense and expose it as the weakness it truly is? To see why defending destroys you, we need to meet the master of manipulation himself, Machiavelli. Every great drama needs a villain, and in the theatre of politics, villains rarely come dressed in black capes. They come wrapped in power, privilege, and arrogance, so thick they can no longer see the people they were meant to serve. The antagonist of our story is no exception. This is the figure who has built their career not on dignity, but on domination. They parade across stages with the smugness of someone who believes rules do not apply to them. Their words drip with contempt for the very people whose votes they once begged for. If they don't like how I lead, they can leave, they once sneered in an interview, dismissing critics as though democracy itself were a nuisance. The scandals piled up, each one more revealing than the last. Lavish parties paid for by donor money, insider deals that enriched their friends while ordinary families struggled to keep the lights on, a private jet trip to a resort during a natural disaster, while their own constituents lined up for bottled water. Yet, every time the accusations surfaced, their instinct was the same: defend, deny, explain. I did nothing wrong, they would insist, again and again, not realizing that the more they defended, the guiltier they appeared. Their hypocrisy was legendary. They preached about family values while whispers of secret affairs spread across tabloids. They lectured about fiscal responsibility while funneling taxpayer funds into pet projects and vanity monuments. Every speech about sacrifice was undercut by images of them dining in gold-plated halls, far removed from the communities they claimed to represent. What made it worse was not the corruption itself, but the arrogance that accompanied it. They didn't just bend the rules, they believed they were untouchable. When confronted, they smirked. When challenged, they mocked. At one rally, when asked about allegations of abuse of power, they laughed into the microphone and said, "That's just jealousy talking." The crowd booed, but the cameras caught the smirk, that smugness that said, "You can't touch me." This was the face of entitlement, the embodiment of hubris. A politician who thought defending themselves over and over would erase their sins. They didn't understand that with every defense, they dug their grave deeper. With every denial, they reinforced the accusation. They mistook talking for strength, when in reality, it exposed their fear, and yet, in their mind, they remained invincible. Surrounded by yes men, applauded by donors, they never stopped to realize how much ground they were losing with ordinary people. Their arrogance had become their armor, and their blindness, history, has shown us this type of figure countless times. Leaders who believed their own myth until the moment it collapsed. Emperors who thought the throne was permanent. Presidents who thought public trust could be bought with explanations. CEOs who thought one press conference could silence the storm. They all shared the same flaw. They defended. They explained. They scrambled. And in doing so, they proved the very weakness their enemies wanted the world to see. Our antagonist is not just one person. They are an archetype, the arrogant elite who cannot resist defending themselves, who cannot resist feeding the fire, who cannot resist trying to justify the unjustifiable. And because of that weakness, because of that hubris, they became the perfect villain for a new kind of confrontation. But every villain's downfall begins with blindness. And in their arrogance, in their constant need to justify, they never saw what was coming. They never imagined that someone could stand across from them, refuse the frame, and dismantle their power without ever raising their voice. Their arrogance blinded them to the one person ready to stand up. Before the clash on the debate stage, before the cameras and the lights, there was a story, quiet, almost invisible, about a life built on resilience rather than privilege. The hero of this story was not born into wealth, nor were they handed the keys of power by family connections. They came from a family that knew the sting of sacrifice, the ache of uncertainty, and the relentless grind of starting over in a land that promised opportunity but demanded everything in return. Their parents were immigrants, arriving with little more than a suitcase and a dream. They worked jobs that few others wanted, long shifts in kitchens, overnight cleaning shifts, bending their backs in fields under a punishing sun. They never complained, but their children could see the toll it took. The calloused hands, the weary eyes, the quiet sighs when the bills stacked higher than the paychecks. What kept them moving wasn't luxury or ambition. It was family, dignity, and the belief that their children would have a better life. The young protagonist absorbed these lessons early. While others bragged about summer vacations, they spent summers helping translate documents for neighbors who didn't speak English, tutoring younger kids in the community, and working part-time jobs to help their parents cover rent. They understood, perhaps too young, that survival required more than effort. It required unshakable willpower and a refusal to let circumstances dictate destiny. Education became their weapon. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only path forward. Nights were spent under the yellow glow of library lights, devouring books that opened worlds their family could never visit. History, philosophy, political theory, they searched for answers, for frameworks to explain why power seemed so unfairly distributed, why some voices echoed across the halls of authority, while others were silenced at the door. What set them apart was not just intelligence but composure. They learned early that in a society quick to dismiss, anger was a luxury they couldn't afford. So they trained themselves in patience, in dignity, and calm. When insulted for their accent, they didn't snap back, they sharpened their words. When doubted for their heritage, they didn't defend, they demonstrated excellence. And when told they didn't belong, they built a life that proved otherwise. Their path into public service wasn't glamorous. It began in community centers, in late-night meetings about housing shortages, in quiet advocacy for families who were ignored by City Hall. They weren't the loudest voice, but they were the most consistent. People began to notice. This was someone who didn't just speak of values, but lived them. Someone who remembered the struggles of those without privilege because they had lived those struggles themselves. By the time they entered the national stage, their reputation was not built on scandal or spectacle, but on trust. Immigrant families saw themselves in their story. Young activists saw proof that resilience could break barriers. And ordinary citizens, tired of arrogance, tired of excuses, saw a figure who carried dignity like armor. And yet, for all their preparation, the confrontation with the antagonist felt deeply personal. Because this wasn't just a clash of politics, it was a clash of worlds. On one side stood entitlement, the smirk of someone who had always known comfort, who thought explanations could erase hypocrisy. On the other side stood sacrifice, the quiet dignity of someone who had clawed their way from nothing, who had seen firsthand the weight of injustice. To the hero, this wasn't simply about winning a debate. It was about honoring their parents' sacrifices, about defending the invisible communities who had been silenced too long. It was about proving that resilience was stronger than arrogance, that humility was more powerful than hubris. It was about showing every young person from the margins that their story mattered, that their voice could not be dismissed with a smirk. And so when they stepped onto that debate stage, their preparation was not measured in rehearsed lines or expensive suits. It was measured in years of struggle, in lessons learned under fluorescent lights, in quiet nights when giving up would have been easier but was never an option. Their calm was not an act, it was the product of survival. Their composure was not strategy, it was identity. The clash was inevitable. The antagonist, drunk on entitlement, believed they were facing another opponent who would stumble, defend, and collapse. But what they failed to see was that across from them stood a person forged in fire, hardened by sacrifice and trained by life itself, never to give away power by defending. No one could have predicted how perfectly their journey had prepared them for this moment. The debate hall was electric before it even began. Cameras flashed, commentators whispered into microphones, and millions tuned in from their living rooms, phones, and laptops. Everyone expected a battle, but no one knew just how raw and dangerous it would become. The antagonist stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. Their chin tilted slightly upward, their smirk rehearsed, their stride radiating arrogance. They weren't there to discuss policy. They were there to dominate, to humiliate, to crush their opponent under the weight of insults and theatrics. The first strike came early, a sly remark disguised as humor. "Some people just aren't ready for this stage," the villain sneered, glancing sideways at the hero. "They might be good at running little neighborhood meetings, but this," he gestured broadly to the audience and cameras. "This is the big leagues," the crowd murmured. Some laughed. The moderators shifted uncomfortably. The hero, however, didn't flinch. They stood tall, hands calmly folded, eyes steady on their opponent. Silence was their first weapon. The antagonist, sensing blood, pressed harder. "You know," they continued, voice rising, "I respect ambition, but ambition without experience, that's dangerous. We can't hand over the future of this nation to someone who doesn't even understand how power works. It's reckless. It's irresponsible. It's, frankly, embarrassing." Gasps rippled through the audience. The camera zoomed in on the hero's face, searching for cracks, a twitch, a scowl, any sign of weakness. There was none. Only composure. The insults escalated. The villain dragged up half-truths, distorted old quotes, even cheap personal jabs. "Tell me," they said, leaning forward with theatrical disgust, "how can someone who's never built anything, never led anything, never commanded anything, possibly think they belong here? You don't even belong on this stage. It was brutal." It was designed not to argue, but to annihilate. The antagonist wasn't debating issues. They were attacking identity, worth, existence itself. And yet the hero remained still. Every insult hung in the air, unanswered. Every jab landed against a wall of silence. The audience leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats. They wanted a reaction, a rebuttal, a furious defense. But none came. The silence became unbearable. The longer the hero refused to engage, the more desperate the villain became. Their smirk began to harden. Their voice sharpened, cracked with frustration. What was supposed to be effortless dominance was turning into something else, exposure. Each insult revealed more about the antagonist than about the hero. Commentators whispered nervously in their booths. Was this restraint brilliance or weakness? Would the silence break the spell or seal the hero's doom? The room grew tense. Every insult now echoed like a hammer against a wall that refused to fall. The audience shifted in their seats, their anticipation growing unbearable. The villain, red-faced now, spat their final insult with venom. "You're a fraud. A complete fraud. And deep down, you know it." The silence that followed was deafening. For a full breath, the hero said nothing. The nation leaned in, and then, with the entire nation watching, the hero finally spoke. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Millions held their breath, waiting for the inevitable defense, the rehearsed talking points, the nervous explanation. But instead, the hero lifted their head, eyes steady, posture unbroken, and let the pause stretch until the room itself seemed to lean forward. And then they spoke. "You've spent the last 5 minutes telling America who you think I am," the hero said softly, their voice calm but carrying across the auditorium. "But let me tell America who you really are," a collective gasp. The crowd shifted. Even the moderators froze. The hero didn't rush. They let the words settle like stones dropped into still water. Each sentence deliberate, each pause perfectly timed. "You call me inexperienced. Yet while I was working alongside families struggling to put food on the table, you were busy cutting deals that made those same families poorer. You talk about leadership, but when leadership was needed, when crises hit, when lives were on the line, you were nowhere to be found." The villain's smirk faltered. Cameras zoomed in on the sudden tension etched into their face. The hero continued, voice unwavering. "You accuse me of ambition without experience. But my experience is the life of every immigrant child who grew up translating bills for their parents. My experience is every community I've stood with when no cameras were rolling. My experience is the fight for dignity that people like you have spent years trying to deny." The audience erupted into applause, raw, uncontainable, almost explosive. The moderators tried to quiet them, but the energy couldn't be contained. The hero lifted a hand, gently calming the crowd. And then with surgical precision, they began dismantling the villain's image piece by piece. "You say I've built nothing, but I have built trust where you built walls. I've built opportunity where you built barriers. I've built hope where you spread fear. And you know why this matters?" The pause hit like a drumbeat, because America isn't built by those who shout the loudest or sit in the highest offices. It's built by those who rise from nothing and keep rising despite people like you. Gasps, cheers, and thunderous clapping filled the auditorium. The villain shifted uncomfortably, their once certain swagger dissolving under the weight of the words. But the hero wasn't finished. They leaned slightly forward, voice quieter now, almost intimate, forcing every ear to strain to hear. "You call me a fraud. But the truth is, the fraud is the man who stands here pretending to speak for the people while living a life completely cut off from them. The fraud is the man who sells his soul to the highest bidder while preaching morality to others. The fraud is the man who dares to talk about responsibility while leaving the powerless to suffer the consequences of his greed." The villain's face paled. Their hands twitched at the podium, as if grasping for something solid. The cameras captured everything, the crack in their armor, the first sign of collapse. The hero let the silence stretch again. Then came the proof, the kind of revelation no defense could counter. "You want to talk about experience? Let's talk about your record. You voted against healthcare for veterans while enjoying taxpayer-funded benefits yourself. You lobbied for corporations that poisoned our water, then told families to drink bottled. You stood in front of laid-off workers and promised new jobs, while signing deals to ship those same jobs overseas." The crowd gasped, some booing outright. The moderators shuffled their papers nervously, knowing they had lost control of the stage. "And worst of all," the hero continued, their voice rising with conviction, "you stand here tonight pretending to defend America's values, when in truth you've spent your career eroding them. Justice, equality, dignity, you sold them all to the highest bidder." The villain's face glistened with sweat under the lights. Their jaw tightened, but no words came. For the first time in their long career, they had nothing to say. The heroes straightened, their presence filling the stage. Their tone shifted, no longer personal, but universal. "This isn't about me. It never was. This debate, this election, this moment, it's about us. About whether we continue to let arrogance, corruption, and fear guide our future. Or whether we rise together, not as enemies, but but as a people determined to reclaim justice, equality, and dignity. The crowd leapt to their feet, applause echoing like thunder. Chants began, rolling through the auditorium, spilling into the streets outside. It was no longer just a debate, it was a movement igniting in real time. The villains stood frozen, their earlier confidence shattered. Their eyes darted across the stage, searching for escape, for control, for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left. The power had shifted irrevocably, undeniably. Before the eyes of the entire nation, the hero let the roar continue, then raised their voice one final time. No, I will not defend myself against your insults. Because the truth doesn't need defending. It needs declaring. And tonight, we declare it together. The audience erupted into a frenzy. Cheers, chants, tears streaming down faces. Even those who had doubted moments earlier found themselves swept up in the tide. The villains' collapse was complete, their power stripped away in full public view. The heroes stepped back from the podium, calm once again, their expression serene. They had not defended. They had not explained. They had flipped the entire frame, turning attack into exposure, humiliation into triumph. And as the cameras captured the moment, it became clear that this was no ordinary debate performance. This was history being written live. The moderators, overwhelmed by the noise, struggled to regain order. The villain fumbled with their notes, their face red, their words failing. But it didn't matter anymore. The narrative had shifted permanently. In that single exchange, everything changed. The hall vibrated with energy, the nation with disbelief. Commentators scrambled to capture the magnitude of what had just unfolded, because the moment had already slipped beyond the stage. Within minutes, clips flooded social media. Millions replayed the takedown, sharing it, captioning it, turning it into the story of the night, the week, the year. The villain's collapse was immortalized in pixels and sound bites. The hero's calm dismantling spread across feeds like wildfire. The moment went viral within minutes, but the shockwaves had just begun. It began with a single clip, less than a minute long, ripped from the debate livestream and uploaded onto Twitter. The video captured the exact moment the hero turned the attack back on the villain. The pause, the piercing words, the eruption of applause. Within 30 seconds of being posted, it had already been retweeted thousands of times. By the time the debate ended, it had exploded into millions of views. The hashtags rose like a tide. Truth doesn't defend. Mic drop moment. Dignity wins. Screens across the nation lit up with the same replay over and over. People in subway cars huddled over their phones, gasping and cheering at the clip as if watching it live. Families in small towns gathered around televisions, replaying the moment on YouTube. For one night, the nation seemed united not by division, but by awe at what they had just witnessed. And then came the memes. Within hours, the internet had transformed the villain's crumbling face into 1,000 punchlines. Split-screen edits showed the villain sweating beside captions like, "When you realize the truth doesn't need defending." Others looped the hero's words over dramatic music, turning the speech into a rallying cry. TikTok users remixed the takedown into rap verses and cinematic edits. Teenagers, parents, veterans, immigrants, everyone seemed to have their own version of the moment, their own way of claiming a piece of it. Commentators rushed to respond. On late-night shows, comedians opened with monologues mocking the villain's silence. Political analysts leaned in, their tones sharpened with rare admiration, declaring it one of the most decisive debate moments in modern history. Talk radio buzzed, podcasts dropped emergency episodes. Even celebrities who rarely waded into politics posted clips of the speech with captions like, "This is how you do it." But the most telling reaction came not from the pundits or the celebrities, it came from ordinary people. Workers on their lunch breaks shared it with co-workers, whispering, "Did you see this? Finally, someone said it." Parents told their children, "This is what standing tall looks like." Students scribbled the hero's words onto notebook covers and bathroom mirrors. The speech became more than a moment. It became a mirror in which millions saw their own dignity reflected back. Meanwhile, the villain fell into a suffocating silence. Their social media accounts went quiet. Their spokespeople stumbled through weak press releases, insisting the debate was a distraction. But the people weren't listening. The narrative had already shifted. The villain was no longer the feared operator of power. They had become a symbol of arrogance exposed, a cautionary tale in real time. Every hour brought a new wave of resonance. Hashtags trended across continents. Crowds gathered outside campaign offices chanting the hero's words. In classrooms, teachers played the clip to spark discussions about integrity. In churches and mosques, leaders cited it as an example of truth prevailing over arrogance. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, silence, retreat, collapse. On the other, a rising voice echoing through every screen, every conversation, every corner of the public square. And yet, beneath the applause and the memes, something deeper was stirring. People weren't just entertained. They were inspired. They weren't just laughing at the villain. They were holding themselves taller, remembering that they, too, had the power not to defend, but to declare. Journalists noted a surge in voter registrations in communities that had long been ignored. Activists spoke of a sudden influx of volunteers. The ripple effect reached beyond politics into the very fabric of daily life. For a brief moment, cynicism seemed to loosen its grip, replaced by something rarer, harder to define, a sense of collective dignity. The villain had hoped to weaken their opponent with insults. Instead, they had exposed their own emptiness. And the hero, by refusing to defend, had not only flipped the power but unleashed a movement. The stage had been cleared. The crowd had roared. The internet had immortalized it. But the story was not finished, because the most powerful part wasn't the applause, it was the lesson left behind. The roar of applause, the endless retweets, the viral explosion, all of it was unforgettable. But the deeper power of that moment wasn't confined to the debate stage. It lived in something timeless, something you and I face every single day, the trap of defending ourselves. Think about it. At work, when a colleague whispers that you don't belong in the room, the natural instinct is to protest, to explain, to justify. But the moment you defend, you step onto their battlefield. You legitimize their accusation by answering it. And suddenly you're no longer leading. You're reacting, or in relationships. Someone throws out a cutting remark, questioning your intentions, your worth, your love. You want to defend to prove them wrong. But defense only feeds the fire. Silence, confidence, redirection. Those are the choices that reclaim dignity, even online, in the endless storm of arguments and call-outs. The pressure to type out your defense, to clap back, to explain yourself into the void of strangers who will never be satisfied. Every time the trap is the same. Defense drains your power. Refusal shifts it back into your hands. That's what Machiavelli knew centuries ago. Buried in his ruthless advice to princes and power brokers was a lesson so dangerous it still rattles the powerful today. Defend nothing. Own everything. Flip the power instantly. Because here's the truth. When you defend, you look guilty even if you're not. When you explain, you sound weaker, even if you're right. But when you refuse, when you stand tall and declare your truth without apology, you turn the spotlight around. Suddenly, the accuser is exposed, their tactics revealed, their power slipping, and this is bigger than politics. It's bigger than debates. It's the law of dignity itself. Every immigrant who's ever been told they don't belong, every worker who's been underestimated, every person whose identity has been questioned, whose voice has been mocked. The lesson is the same. Do not waste your breath defending your existence. Your existence is the defense. Your dignity is the proof. The hero on that stage didn't just win an argument. They showed us what it looks like to rise above the noise, to refuse the trap, to flip the frame so completely that arrogance collapses under its own weight. And that's something every one of us can carry, not just in politics, but in the small battles of everyday life. The next time you're accused, insulted, underestimated, but remember Machiavelli's forbidden trick. Remember that defending only makes you smaller, but standing in your truth makes you unshakable. Dignity will always be greater than defensiveness. And that's why Machiavelli's forbidden trick still terrifies the powerful to this day.
So what did we witness?
Not just a debate performance, not just another viral clip. We saw the forbidden truth in action. Never defend yourself. That's the Machiavellian trick. The hero didn't waste a second explaining. They didn't shrink under fire. They flipped the power with calm, with clarity, with dignity, and that's the lesson for all of us. The next time you're under attack, whether it's at work, in a relationship, online, or even in your own family, remember this. Silence and strength are louder than 1,000 excuses. You don't need to justify your existence. You don't need to answer every insult. You stand taller by refusing to step into the trap. That's why this moment will live on. Not because one politician outsmarted another, but because it revealed something deeper about power itself. The person who refuses to defend is the one who controls the story. And in life, as in politics, the story is everything. If this lesson hit home, if you felt that spark of recognition, don't let it fade. Carry it into your own life. And join us here, where we uncover more of these forbidden lessons of power, the truths history tried to hide. Subscribe, share this video, be part of the community that refuses to play the game on the enemy's terms. Because in the end, knowledge is the ultimate weapon, and when you know the trick, you can never be trapped again, never defend, always own. That's how dignity wins.